Upon a mill opening, women in the catchment areas are 26% less likely to self-report domestic violence in the past 12 months. And I also show that it is 20% less likely for the hospitals in the catchment areas to have a domestic violence patient in a harvest month compared to 1 month before the beginning of the harvest season.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. About 1 in every 3 women worldwide have experienced either physical or sexual violence from their partners. If we could provide better employment opportunities for women, well, in theory that could reduce domestic violence. But strong empirical evidence for this has been hard to find. Deniz Sanin of the University of South Carolina has measured the effect of work opportunities for women in Rwanda on domestic violence, and she joins me now. Deniz, welcome to VoxDevTalks.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Deniz, first of all, the scale of this epidemic of violence, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Where does that 1 in 3 statistic come from?
It's exactly extraordinary. The statistic is coming from World Health Organization. So the official statistic is that about 1 in every 3 women worldwide experience physical and or sexual violence, sexual domestic violence, or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. But since the majority of the statistic is coming from actually domestic violence, usually in this context, basically about 1 in every 3 women is now adopted as the main statistic. If you ask me, then what is the actual statistic? Now, according to the recent statistic of the World Health Organization, the lifetime prevalence of physical and sexual domestic violence is 27%. And if we look regionally, unfortunately, in developing countries, the rate of prevalence is much, much higher.
Yeah. Okay, now in theory, we often talk about how female employment could be a way to reduce this problem. Why is that?
Yeah, it's based on 3 main channels. The first channel is what I call the woman empowerment channel, or like women's bargaining power channel, in the sense that when there's women employment, there's an increase in women's earnings, which means that there's an increase in women's outside options. Basically, the women are able to credibly threat their husbands with like separation and divorce and so on. This increases their bargaining power, and then this can lead to a decrease in domestic violence. This is the first plausible channel. The second channel is actually coming from the criminology literature, which is called exposure reduction. When women go out and work, there is a decrease in the time couples spend together. So there can be actually a mechanical decline, given the fact that they're seeing each other less. There will be less time for violence, so there can be a decrease in domestic violence. The third channel is what economists can actually define it as like an income effect, given the fact that a woman's employment is also an increase in the overall household resources that can actually decrease the financial tension in the household. So that can decrease domestic violence as well. Yet, like, these are all the channels that can decrease domestic violence due to female employment. But I need to say that research also shows that when there is an increase in women's resources, domestic violence can increase as well. This is either due to male backlash, because now the breadwinner norm is threatened for the husband, or actually the husbands can have increased incentives to use the violence as a tool to extract those new resources due to female employment. So that can also increase domestic violence as well. So actually, in theory, it is ambiguous of like how female employment can affect domestic violence. This is one of the reasons of why I'm interested in the topic. Like, what's happening if we give jobs to women? Are we hurting woman, or will it be like a beneficial policy? That's the reason why I was interested in the topic, actually.
And this is incredibly important. It affects potentially more than half the population of the planet. Why do we not know more about this empirically?
I see it as an issue of like both measurement and identification. On the measurement side, it is a hard task to find data that measures domestic violence accurately. Data sets that are self-reported can be susceptible to reporting bias, but usually that kind of self-reported data also has advantages because they're usually a part of the big household survey where we know a lot of information about the woman, but again, subject to reporting bias. If we just use hospital records or police records, that also have disadvantages. On the first side, there will not be a reporting bias per se, but then we we will be capturing just the women who go to hospital, just the women who go to police, and so on. And that will also be not capturing the pictures. Also for the hospital records, we will be able to see just the cases very severe but there's also like non-severe cases as well. So it's a very hard task to measure domestic violence accurately and like find even like both of the data sets. But on top of the measurement side, it is also not an easy task to find a plausibly exogenous variation that enables a researcher to identify the effect of providing jobs to women. And on top of that, having both good data and having a basically plausibly exogenous variation, combining the two is not an easy and common thing to have. And I think that is the reason why we don't have that much of evidence up until this point.
So the story of your natural experiment, this takes place in Rwanda. It begins about 20 years ago, and it starts with a new government policy.
Even through tough economic periods, we have always maintained a strong belief that we will produce one of the world's finest coffees in our volcanic soils and idyllic climate. This determination has borne fruit. Rwanda Coffee, a second sunrise.
What was this policy?
The main natural experiment is the rapid expansion of coffee mills in Rwanda. We can think of like the small-scale coffee factories in Rwanda, basically. In 2002, the government adopted the policy called National Coffee Strategy, which aimed to shift to mill-processed coffee production to participate in the international specialty coffee market. International specialty coffee market is the coffee that you see in Starbucks. And actually, that's how I come up with the idea. I was in a lunch line and saw Rwandan coffee in Starbucks, and I got interested in the topic, basically, true story. After that decision in the early 2000s, there is a public-private partnership project between the US government and Rwandan government and some private firms and so on, which helped the farmers to establish cooperatives and build mills in their communities. And a rapid expansion took place right after the project.
So at this time that the policy was announced, if a farmer wanted to grow and sell coffee, what was the process for the household to do this?
Before the policy, what was happening is the fact that coffee farmers clean coffee cherries, dry them and sort out the defectives all by their hand and sell the products in the local market for a low price. Drying and sorting are female-dominated tasks and selling is the male-dominated task. So in this context, the husbands receive and control the income and women do not have any personal income. After the mill open in an area, inside the catchment area of a mill, now the husband is selling the coffee cherries to the mill. So the buyer becomes the mill, and the harvest of the coffee plant are cleaned by the machinery in the mills. The machines are not able to dry and sort out the coffee, which is the woman's task. So mainly for these tasks, the mill are demanding paid labor from the catchment area. And again, since those tasks are female-dominated tasks, the opening of a mill in an area is an opportunity for the woman to transition from being an unpaid family worker in the coffee plot to a wage worker, paid worker in the mill.
So clearly these mills are a huge change to how coffee is farmed and how people make money from farming the coffee. Take me through how they work day to day.
I need to highlight the fact that it changed a lot, but it only changed for the farmers who lives within the catchment area of a coffee mill. So once a mill open in an area, it provides the opportunities only to the coffee farmers who live within the catchment area of a mill, which is a circle, buffer zone around the mill. So the reason why the coffee mill has a specific catchment area is based on the agricultural feature of the plant. The coffee cherries, upon harvested, needs to be transported to a mill within very few hours after the harvest, giving the fact that if it's not the case, the coffee will rot. And by the time the coffee farmer is bringing the produce to the mill, the coffee will not be accepted and they will not be able to benefit from the opportunities from the mill. So it's a change, but at the same time, it's a change specifically for the coffee farmers who live in the catchment area of a mill. It is a change for the husband as the wife, but the main transition is for the wife in the sense that now she has the opportunity to transition from an unpaid family worker to mainly a wage worker in the mill.
So what sort of hours of employment are the women getting from this? How likely are they to take the jobs as well?
this is a seasonal job. So within a year, the mills open only during the harvest season, a few months within a year. So once the harvest season is on, specifically during the peak of the harvest, which is end of the harvest, the couple is bringing their harvest to the coffee mills. And specifically during the peak of the harvest, which is the few months at the end of the harvest season, women are working in the mills in high numbers.
So in this research, you are looking at the impact of female employment on domestic violence. As you've already pointed out, it's hard to find reliable statistics about domestic violence. Where did you find your data? How confident of it are you?
I'm confident in my data sets, given the fact that as a unique feature of the paper, I am using both self-reported data as well as novel monthly administrative records on the universe of hospitalizations for domestic violence in the country. Given the fact that I use both data sets, and both of those data sets lead me to find a decline in domestic violence, that suggests the fact that my results are not subject to reporting bias, and it's reliable due to the fact that I'm using two different data sets and I'm finding the same result.
How is it possible for you to match those reports of domestic violence to the occupations of the people who are reporting it as subjected to it?
This is thanks to the spatial nature of the dataset. The datasets that I'm using are georeference, which means that I have the GPS locations of the mills. I have the GPS locations of the couples. Also, I have the GPS locations of the hospitals. So I'm able to link the couples as well as the hospitals with the mills and their catchment area, whether they are within and outside of the catchment area, which enables me to compare what is the difference of the violence level of the couples who live within and outside of the catchment area, and also the hospital patients that are in and outside of the catchment area. So it's all thanks to the nature of the georeference nature of the data sets that I'm using.
I see. And is this how you establish that causal relationship?
Exactly.
So you said that you established that there was a decline in violence. How big is the difference?
So I show first that upon a mill opening, women in the catchment areas are 18% more likely to work for cash. Mm-hmm. There is no change in the overall labor supply behavior, but specifically changing that they're more likely to work for cash. And after that, I also show that upon a mill opening, women in the catchment areas are 26% less likely to self-report domestic violence in the past 12 months. And I also show that it is 20% less likely for the hospitals in the catchment areas to have a domestic violence patient in a harvest month compared to 1 month before the beginning of the harvest season.
This is all very encouraging news, but there is only temporary employment here. So if you have this decline during the time that the mills are giving women paid employment, when it's not the harvest season, do levels of domestic violence return to what they were before?
Yeah, this is something that I was surprised to see in the data. So yes, first, this is temporary employment, seasonal employment. And what I see with the hospitalization data is that there is a decline in hospitalizations during the harvest season, and the level of domestic violence goes back up shortly after the harvest season. But one thing that is very important that I need to clarify is that the hospitalization data is coming from at the end of the expansion period, when the number of the mills are fixed and the mills are already there. So what the hospitalization data is showing is that once the mills are there, there is an additional decline in domestic violence during the harvest season, and then the levels goes back up to the original pre-harvest level after the harvest season. But this doesn't mean that the employment did not have any effect on domestic violence. Basically, still the areas where it has the mills has a lower level of violence compared to the areas which does not have any mill at all. But that additional decline during the harvest, unfortunately, that disappears after the harvest season.
Can we say whether this is about women's empowerment, or is it a reduction in financial stress in the household that's causing this?
Specifically, maybe this is nothing related to women's employment and the resources and so on, but just due to the fact that there's also an increase in men's earnings, since men are earning more to selling to the mill compared to the market. And maybe that is the thing that is driving the results. In order to test this mechanism, I use couples where there is an increase in household resources only due to women's employment, not due to men's earnings. Such couples are basically couples who have different occupations. So the majority majority of the couples are like coffee farmer couples. The wife is a coffee farmer and the husband is a coffee farmer. But I also have couples where the wife is a coffee farmer or like farmer in general, but like married to men with non-agricultural manual jobs, like truck driver, construction worker, plumber, and so on. What I find is that given the fact that that's a non-agricultural job, there is no change in men's earnings for those couples. There is increase in women's earnings, and there is a decrease in violence, which is similar in magnitude in the overall effect. That means that I have a case where the increase in household resources is only driven by women's employment, and I'm still seeing a decline in domestic violence, which assures me the fact that this is not just a story about there is increase in household resources due to men, and that's the reason why there's a decline in domestic violence. The driver is on the woman's employment side rather than the increase in husband's earnings is the dominant mechanism.
For farmers in Rwanda's Kibungo region, coffee has long been the crop of choice. It thrives in the damp and hilly landscape. Government promotion of the industry has resulted in an increase in coffee plantations.
Does what you've found here suggest that what theory predicts is what we're actually seeing in practice?
Yes and no at the same time. I find evidence for some theories, but I also reject some others as well. So let's go like one by one. The first one is the increase in women's bargaining power channel. So what I find is that women in the catchment area, upon a mill opening, are more likely to make financial decisions as well as decision to take up contraceptive, either alone or jointly with their husbands, relatively to their husbands are making the decision for them. Which suggests the fact that there is an increase in women's bargaining power when women are exposed to the mill. So the second channel, as I said earlier, is the exposure reduction channel, which is pretty popular in the criminology literature. So in order to test whether the decrease in the time couples spend together is the driver of the results, I mainly focus on the couples where there is presumably no change in exposure before and after a mill opening. Those are couples with different occupations. Again, let's remember the fact that the wife is the farmer and she is married to a man who has a non-agricultural manual job. Observe the fact that those couples were already not seeing each other during the day, given the fact that they have different occupations. They're not like coffee farmer couples who was seeing each other all day long. So what happens when a mill opens in an area, they continue to not see each other during the day, but what's happening is basically a mill opening is a shock to the woman's earnings. And again, as I said earlier, I'm seeing a decline similar in magnitude to the overall effect, which suggests the fact that among the couples where the exposure is presumably fixed, and I'm seeing in the data the fact that the women are not reporting a way higher number of hours, I'm finding a similar decline, which suggests the fact that the exposure reduction is not necessarily the dominant mechanism behind the results. The last channel is the increase in household resources due to women's earnings. I already rule out the fact that due to husband's earnings, that's not driving the result, but still there is an overall increase in the household earnings due to women is now working outside of the home. So this is something that I'm currently working on. I'm currently editing the paper, and by bringing new data, this is something that I test. And in order to test this mechanism, what I would like to focus on is the seasonality of the results. Like, as we go over, there is seasonality in the hospitalization results, which is there is a decline in domestic violence, and domestic violence goes right back up, even like 1 month after it goes back to its pre-harvest level. I recently have data on monthly consumption patterns of the household within a year. There is an increased consumption during the harvest season compared to pre-harvest season for the households. And that increased consumption continues to be there 1 month after the harvest season compared to the pre-harvest, because the households are still using the money that is left over from the harvest. So for the month of August, 1 month right after the harvest season, what we are seeing is that there is still a higher level of household resources compared to pre-harvest. There is more consumption, but domestic violence goes back to the original level, which suggests the fact that the increase in overall household resources is not necessarily the dominant effect behind the results. And after finding this, what I also realized the fact that the seasonality of the results and seasonality of the consumption as well is actually pointing out the fact that there is one more mechanism behind the results that is not that much studied in the literature, which is related to women's productivity. I think one of the reasons why I'm seeing a seasonality in the results is that during the harvest period, men have decreased incentives to engage in violence to beat his wife, given the fact that if he does so, the wife will be less productive. She will not be able to go to work and she will not be able to bring in money to the household. But this incentive is not there once the harvest is over. So I think one of the reasons why I'm seeing a seasonality of the results is related to this productivity channel. So on top of women's bargaining power channel, according to the seasonality of the results, what I argue is that there is one additional channel, which is there is an increased opportunity cost of wife beating during the harvest period, since it's threatened the productivity of the woman. So that is the reason why we're seeing a drop in violence during the harvest season, and it goes back up after the harvest season.
Does this imply that if there were increased opportunities for women to work outside the home in other developing countries, then this would reduce domestic violence there as well?
It's not necessarily that this result will apply to all of the developing countries. Women's bargaining power channel, which is the first channel that I provide the evidence for, can be activated and deactivated based on the laws and social norms of the country. I have another paper on domestic violence in Rwanda, which investigates the impact of a domestic violence legislation on domestic violence. Women being able to unilaterally divorce their husbands if their husbands are violent towards a woman. Beforehand, in Rwanda, if women experience domestic violence, she needs to get husband's consent to get divorced. But after the law, it's basically she can do unilateral divorce upon violence. Women actually are exercising their rights. They got divorced. This law is making the fact that women threatening men with separation or divorce becomes a credible threat. If it's a context where such divorce or separation is not plausible, then the women's bargaining power channel can be deactivated, so we will not be able to see a decline in domestic violence as well. This also goes with the social norms as well. Domestic violence is less of a taboo, like more prevalent in Rwanda compared to Indian context and other contexts and so on. So still it's a credible threat, and like what makes the credible threat, which is laws and social norms and so on, and I think is really affecting whether the results will go in a decline or increase. So that is the reason why I think that this result will not be applicable to all of the developing countries at the end of the day.
Providing opportunities for women to work isn't necessarily going to solve the problems if you do not also think about the gender norms, the society in which this work is provided.
Providing employment opportunities to women has the potential to decrease domestic violence in a developing country context with a particular market structure, laws, and the social norms.
Well, with those caveats, it is still a very encouraging result. Thank you for talking about it today, Deniz.
Thank you, Tim.
The paper's called Paid Work for Women and Domestic Violence, Evidence from the Rwandan Coffee Mills. And the author, of course, Deniz Sanin. This has been a VoxDevTalk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to subscribe. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And all our past episodes are at voxdev.org, where you can also find articles about the papers we feature.